Welcome to Boston Jewish Now. I am Jeremy Burton, and I am joined by our producer, Aryeh Blanche. And this week, we are marking and celebrating the 250th anniversary of America's independence. We thought we'd sit down and talk about that today.
And maybe some background on what we are actually celebrating on Independence Day, because that's not what everyone thinks.
We talk about this as America's birthday, but what is that birthday? And obviously, those of us here in Massachusetts know it is not the beginning of the actual revolution and the military battles that led to the establishment of the United States, because we've been celebrating the 250th anniversary of that going back all the way to last year, with the Battle of, Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and other things that came before July 4th. And it's obviously not the actual recognition of America's independence. That comes later at the Battle of Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. It's not even actually the day on which the Continental Congress declared independence. That's July 2nd. July 4th, the day that our founders and the early generations of this country chose to celebrate as our birthday, is the day in which they signed a document, the Declaration of Independence. So it's not the victory, the acknowledgement. It is the celebration of the birth of an idea of America that is reflected in that document that was signed in Philadelphia on what will be 250 years ago this Saturday.
So what is that idea?
I mean, it is something we've talked about on this podcast before, which is that America is not a nation rooted in ethnicity or shared national origin, but that it is a creed. And I think one way in which that is said best is something that actually Gordon Wood, who some of you will know was a very famous historian at Brown University who was tragically killed in a car accident a few weeks ago at a very old age, but still tragic. He, in one of his final written essays, which was a foreword for a new volume from the Library of America, which is called The Living Declaration, he wrote these words: "To be an American is not to be someone, but to believe in something. And that something that Americans most readily believe in can be found in the Declaration of Independence. By itself, it makes the United States." So the question is, what is it in that declaration that makes the United States? What is that idea? And at the simplest level, it is obviously what's language that is so familiar to so many of us, namely the idea of our God-given, unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in the broader sense, I think it's what so many over the generations, from President Lincoln, who talked about seeing the Declaration as the America he aspired to live in, and reframed that in the Gettysburg Address very much so as a proposition, or whether it was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King at the March on Washington, who described it as a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. That there was in that not necessarily the perfect union on day one, and obviously the language of perfect union comes in the Constitution a few years later, the aspiration to a more perfect union, the always improving. It is also the idea that these were clearly imperfect people. There's no question the founders were deeply flawed. And we need not reiterate again, some of them were owners of chattel slaves. They certainly did not in themselves necessarily see in that moment the commitment to the full freedom and equality of all people, even though they were promising it. But they were laying the groundwork for something, the ever improving, the ever project forward, the idea that we are an experiment and a project rooted in ideas of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all of us. And, times like this when things are rough, and it sometimes feels like those are farther away, at least for many of us, than they were even a few days or a few months ago, it's important to remember that this is not about everything being perfect. It's not about achieving that today, tomorrow, or even in our lifetimes. It is about the forward progress and the commitment to forward progress.
Right. America's not a finished work.
Yeah.
So what would you say to folks who feel disenfranchised with the state of this country? They're unhappy with how things are looking in Washington, or they want to throw away the entire project and start anew. I don't know what they're looking to do that.
There are people, and I think that more and more they're frankly sounding the same in certain ways on the left and on the right, who are throwing away the idea of America. And to be a little bit simplistic, we are seeing on the right those who are saying that, no, the founders were trying to create a Christian nation. The founders, that there is a idea that they are promoting of America as a shared national origin, European, Christian, etc., which is ahistorical. And that is very clear that the founders, both in the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution, were aspiring to a multi-ethnic, non-national identity-based national identity of creed, of an idea, that the aspiration is the things we hold together as one about the dignity of man and the dignity of, well, they said man, but we would say all people. And also on the left, we are seeing a certain anti-American framework, which is anti-pluralist. It's this idea of uniformity and conformity around political ideas and analysis, and not pluralism of a society in which diverse people can hold different ideas and different opinions and function together as one society. And that too is un-American and ahistorical to the ideas that the founders were presenting. And so, I would say for those of us who believe in the idea of America, and I think it's fair to say most Americans still do that, we need to push back against both of those ideologies. The national origin, Christian nationalist narrative on the right, and the groupthink, cultural revolution style, Maoist, conformity on the left. Neither one of those is what the founders would have imagined. And I don't pretend to say that the founders would have imagined everything we are and everything we are dealing with today. They certainly probably did not foresee, by and large, a continental nation and didn't foresee sort of like the challenges of modern technology and a nation that was no longer an island separated from the world, in a sense. But they clearly saw, and it's interesting to have this conversation here on Tuesday morning when the Supreme Court has just upheld birthright citizenship, that when they were having the Supreme Court arguments on birthright citizenship, the Chief Justice made the point that while air travel and transport has changed, still the Constitution hasn't changed. There are things that are constants. And July 4th is about celebrating the Declaration of Independence as a constant, the idea. We have to hold out the hope for the future in the same way that Lincoln held out hope. That Lincoln didn't look at the country he was living in and say, this is a country that is fulfilling the promise of the Declaration, but it was the Declaration and the idea of America that he aspired to, maybe not in his own lifetime, and certainly not in his own lifetime ultimately. And when we talk about that in the context of hope, I often come back in many contexts to the teachings of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, the former chief rabbi of Great Britain. And yes, I recognize the irony of quoting from a British chief rabbi and lord as we're talking about the celebration of America's Independence Day. But hey, we in Boston hosted the English national fans this last week, so why not? But, Lord Sacks talked about hope. And what he said was that optimism and hope are not the same thing. That optimism is the belief that the world is changing for the better, and that hope is the belief that together we can make the world better. And he describes optimism as a passive virtue and then says that hope is an active one. And indeed, to be hopeful requires a great deal of courage because it requires action. And I think that is the constant through American history. People who see themselves situated to the left or to the right, it's not an ideological comment on one side of a political aisle, but people who invest meaning in the Declaration of Independence, people who hope for the forward progress of America, it requires our commitment and our action. And so we're not just celebrating on July 4th the action of the founders. We're not just celebrating the action of the revolutionaries who declared independence and fought for it. We're celebrating every generation of Americans who have picked up that declaration and said, this gives me hope for our country's future, and this calls me to action.
Would you say what gives you hope is this idea that you and others will do better, will make America better collectively?
I'm reminded of the teaching from Jewish tradition, from Pirkei Avot, that ours is not to complete the task, nor is it to desist. And I think that there is something deeply Jewish and deeply rooted in Jewish teaching that is intertwined with the project of America. And it's been so from day one. And we talked about this a few weeks ago when we were celebrating Jewish American heritage at Boston City Hall. And we talked about how Jews who were veterans of the Revolution, wrote to General Washington and the Continental Congress that was writing the Constitution to make the case and to argue successfully that it was important that there not be a oath of loyalty to the Christian faith in order to serve as a public servant in the United States. That same idea, starting from that very first years of our nation, of both Jewish concepts of participation, Jewish ideas about hope and progress and not desisting from the work of that, have been intertwined with the project of America. And for myself, I take strength from their hope. I also think we have a burden of responsibility, which is, who are we to abandon the aspirations and hopes of generations prior to us easily, which is part of why I think we need to reject the discourse on the left and the right that is abandoning American creedal values, because I think they're giving up all too easily on a project that many others have given, frankly, blood and treasure to create and defend and work toward for 250 years. And I think this is a moment to say we're rededicating ourselves on this 250th anniversary to that hope, but also in the spirit of Lord Sachs to say, and that requires us to do work. It requires myself individually as a patriot and an American to do work. It requires all of us as patriots and Americans who call ourselves that to do the work. And it requires us as JCRC to step forward and say, we will continue to do the work with others of a more perfect union.
Happy Independence Day.
Happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day.
There's a lot to celebrate, a lot to be thankful for.
And a lot of work to do.